Shirefolk has become the derogatory term most recognized to refer to those on the periphery of society, those marginalized by those in power. It was not always like this, however. At one time, before the all but predestined phase of the Kingdom of Ormar, the term referred to those diminutive folk that occupied the Shirelands and the upper western provinces within Ormar. These Shirelands were rich and verdant, providing a lengthy growing season, allowing a multitude of grains to be grown and shipped across the lands. Of course, this bounty soon attracted the attention of the humans to the south, and soon the bucolic halflings found themselves with 4 legions of stalwart legionnaires on their doorstep. After the conquest, the term had become an umbrella term, used to refer to all the races that may live in these new shires that the Empire had created, halflings being the vast majority of these. Inheriting these Shirefolk from their conquest, the Kingdom of Ormar initially left them to their own devices. That was until settlers from across the kingdom began migrating to the newly conquered lands, looking for the opportunity to take advantage of the rich farmlands that were common throughout the heartlands. The imperial bureaucracy, as corrupt as it ever was, facilitated these actions by using legionnaires to force the halflings off their land, relocating them to less desirable lands throughout the empire. These new homes became known as shires, though they had nothing in common with the former lands of these halflings. This forced migration obviously caused many shirefolk to have financial problems and bad farmland. This mixed with their awful harvest did not help remedy the situation. The government in Regulbium again left the shirefolk to their own devices, no financial help or other assistance from authority. The new life the halflings had found left little hope for them. The land was harsh, offering little in the way of bounty. Furthermore, the lands were dangerous. Numerous fell beasts could be found eager to raid the halflings' new villages, delivering terror every night. Adults who were not used to the concept of using weapons soon found themselves using what money they could scrounge up to hire groups, human, halfling, or otherwise, to protect them and act as a sort of police force in lieu of any formal support from the Empire. Due to the lack of centralization, groups began claiming areas where they and they alone would do business with shop and homeowners in their turf. Eventually, skirmishes became full-on wars as groups or gangs would fight over turf. One of the most prolific groups would gain its start at this time, around the time of 260 BV, before Valentinian. The Seculi family began establishing itself. What separated the Seculi family from its competition was the fact that it understood the money that could be made not solely from its protection business, but also participating in crime, something that a mere 20 years prior would not have been thinkable by a halfling. They started producing and smuggling large amounts of hallucinogens and narcotics in the sewers. They paid to learn how to make the drugs from the Sun Elves, who were renowned for mixing volatile substances and accidentally creating narcotics, and then sneak them into the large cities. Oftentimes, they relied on the underwatched sewer systems. This is where the sewer culture got its start. Here in the large sanitation systems built by the Omarians is where shirefolk would make their homes by creating the Guild of the Underworld. From this point on, life in Ormar and eventually the Empire changed as different families would start to fight for control of the city's sewers. Many families would grow extremely wealthy and powerful due to their connections with the drug trade and crime. Soon, small-town gangs would fight each other over the right to sell the product of large metropolises.
Religion plays a huge part in the daily lives of the Shirefolk who are a part of the crime families. To be a part of a family is to be part of a cult. The family heads are seen as vessels of the founders of each family, and therefore are worshipped as gods. Shirefolk will put up appearances and pretend to worship Ormar's pantheon, but in their homes and among their families, they do things their own way.
The culture of the Shirefolk is one of oppression and intense poverty. However, for those who aren't a part of the major crime families, they are seen as jolly and happy people. Festivals are very common in the Shires, and drugs and alcohol of all kinds can be found there. Even though not every Shirefolk will join a crime family, they have major respect for them as a whole. The families may do morally grey work, but they always protect their turf, not just from other gangs, but from all threats. Also, they fund organizations to protest for rights for Shirefolk due to humans seeing them as burdens on society. Kids look at leaders of families in awe as men who have been able to escape poverty and fight for the rights of their people. It shouldn't be mistaken though. These families are extremely dangerous, being able to establish connections with powerful merchant clans from the Dwarven Mountains and brushing shoulders with members of the imperial families thanks to their luxurious restaurants and taverns. One of the most shocking aspects of Shirefolk crime culture is their common initiation ritual. Known as Hospitai, an initiate is given a downright suicidal mission to complete. This mission can be anything from a hit to stealing something from the local governor. Not every person who attempts to become members of the families make it into them. A majority of Shirefolk working for the families aren't even in the families themselves. This ensures that only the most talented criminals run the gangs and families.
Crime reached an all-time high for the kingdom of Ormar after Valentinian had conquered all the tribes of Ingisfell. The capital of the empire, Regulbium, became a battleground for all the crime families due to a large portion of the economic activities coming into and out of the capital. From stealing slaves and building high-end taverns and inns, families were able to bribe their way into power and use crooked governors to enforce their authority. Valentinian's son, Commodian, who was the heir to the throne of Ormar, created a branch of the military dedicated to fighting organized crime named Viopis. His main opponent would become the Benedictus family, who established the majority control of Regabulum's underworld. Its head, Titus, was much unlike the rest of the family heads. Usually if you were in charge of a criminal family, you would do your best to keep a low profile. Titus instead loved the attention he got, and the respect he had from the Empire's minority population. Many educated scholars, whether Sun Elf or not, wrote many books about the deeds he had done for Shirefolk and non-humans in the Empire. Things such as bribing judges and threatening governors to change policies to be more lenient towards the treatment of non-humans. Commodian was furious towards the corruption and threw all the resources he had at his disposal to capture Titus and his family. Titus never stayed in one place for too long. He was constantly moving, and even expanding on the sewers underground each city. The crime cities, with their fortunes, would hire citizens en masse to dig tunnels connecting each city to each other. They were able to keep this secret from the imperial government due to only hiring majority halflings and other oppressed races that lived under imperial rule. With the drug money and other systems of income such as money laundering with their fancy clubs, taverns, etc., they were able to fund the construction of an entire underworld transit system where criminals could flee to and even in some cases live in. Small cities of criminals were formed along these tunnels. Through this infrastructure is where the drug trade of the human empire laid, completely invisible and kept that way because as long as the empire kept making an enemy out of their minority populations and not making attempts to integrate them into the empire, they would have no choice but to rely on the black market economy they had made for themselves and use that to make a living. For as soon as Viopis found one tunnel and destroyed it, two more would pop up in another location. Viopis was simply outnumbered by the minority races in the empire, therefore were stretched too thin. Not only that, but Titus along with other families were too embedded in the government. All Titus had to do was pay members of Viopis to feed him intel so he would know when and where they would strike next.